judiciary. There are many struggles ahead for pro-democracy forces in Pakistan, but if the tenacity of your Pakistani American, my Pakistani American constituents is any indicator, democracy and human rights will prevail. And just the final thing I would say, I co-chair a committee called the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. And I've always believed that if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and four square for human rights. We don't always live up to that ideal, but we have to keep on pushing to make it so that we can do better. Standing up for human rights in Pakistan is the right thing to do, and we can. Great.
Your leadership on these issues, because you have been reading letters and and we look forward to sort of taking it to the next level as well and come up with targeted sanctions against those who are responsible for the worst atrocities in Pakistan. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you. And are you continuing to stay for a while?
A little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Great. We'd love to have you for as long as you're able. So I had other remarks to say, and again, I was just talking about how galvanized the Pakistani community is. We have secured the support of representatives across the political spectrum. We have progressive Democrats, we have national security Democrats, we have Trump-aligned Republicans, we have regular Republicans, and they have all come on board in terms of supporting human rights and democracy in Pakistan just over the past year. Even though we're a nascent movement, we're just getting started, but just over the past year, after Pakistan's flawed elections that were massively rigged, 368 congressional representatives voted on the House of the Floor to support House Resolution 901, calling for an investigation into those elections. And then there were a flurry of letters, right? There were almost 100 congressional reps called for the release of Imran Khan and all political prisoners who are detained illegally, as the UN and Amnesty International have told us. And then in October, led by Congressman Jim McGovern, Greg Kazar, and Samali, we had 62 congressional Democrats sign off calling on the Biden administration for targeted sanctions against people like General Asim Munir. And so that is something that we want to However, despite all of that, at the end of the year, we did not see any meaningful change there was no consequences for the overall US-Pakistan relationship, despite all the repression that was taking place. And a culture of impunity was created. And then what did that lead us to? That led us to one of the most horrific events that took place in the heart of Islamabad, the capital city of Pakistan. And that is the focus of our discussion today. We will talk about the horrific events of November 26th, in which the Pakistani security forces used lethal weapons against unarmed protesters, killing at least 15 and injuring hundreds. 2 months later, dozens and dozens of people remain missing and unaccounted for, and they are presumed dead. Our forum today will examine various dimensions of this brutal crackdown and the cover-up that took place in its aftermath. From a variety of different perspectives, we will end with specific recommendations that we believe should be pursued in Congress against Pakistan's civilian and military leadership. We have an excellent lineup of speakers who will sort of discuss different dimensions, and I will introduce them as it becomes their turn to speak. First of all, we have, I will invite actually Dr. Mueet Pirzada, who is a leading Pakistani journalist and former broadcast TV anchor, as well as the editor of Global Village Space. He will provide us with the overall context in which the Islamabad massacre took place, as well as the failure of Western media outlets to effectively cover it.
Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Adani and Congressman Greg Kazar for organizing this, Congressman. Thank you, Congressman Jim McGovern. I just heard the comment. Thank you so much for it. And Congressman Kruger, who just left after making this comment. I have a prepared testimony. I was asked to basically wind. We have shortage of time, so I quickly return to my prepared points. For context, it's important to emphasize that I have worked with top media networks, including a great broadcaster, as television anchor, political analyst and editor since 2005. I have written extensively on Pakistani politics and have been founder editor of print and online publications. Before media, I worked for more than 10 years with federal government in Pakistan. These roles have provided me meaningful access to the top civil military, decision makers, politicians, legislators, and judiciary of Pakistan. Honorable Congressman, while Pakistan has been defined as a state moving from crisis to crisis since its inception, the Islamabad massacre of November 2024, in which hundreds of people were shot, literally at the gates of its Parliament and Supreme Court, and bodies made to disappear, like the Banana Massacre in Colombia of 1928, was unprecedented even in Pakistan's troubled history. This represents a clear and present danger for US interests in South and Central Asia, and the growing instability, Congressman, is increasing immigration pressures towards Europe via Mediterranean. Asylum applications are also piling up in the US borders from Pakistan. Honorable Congressman and fellow gentlemen, but we have not reached this dangerous situation overnight. Pakistan, a nation of almost 250 million, fifth largest in the world after China, India, China, United States, and Indonesia, second largest Muslim nation, and the only Muslim country with nuclear weapons, with almost 1 million trained men in uniform in arms, is increasingly on boil since a military-led regime change operation in April 2022 against the government of Prime Minister Imran Khan. Since then, country with more than 65% under the age of 35, facing an economic meltdown, water, food, and energy shortages, is being run by a military with growing brutality and in total disregard of United Nations and international human rights conventions. Since April 2022, while courts have been made to collapse, more than 20,000 men and women have been arrested, hundreds have been tortured, journalists, lawyers, human rights activists, and poets have been abducted, forced to go underground or seek protection in Western democracies like myself. I left when a dear colleague, an outspoken critic of the military, Arshad Sharif, was chased and murdered in Kenya on 23rd October 2022. 10 days later, an assassin almost murdered Imran Khan, the former Prime Minister and country's most popular leader. But both criminal acts, Congressman, to this day have not been properly investigated. Biden administration, for reasons not understood, completely ignored the crisis developing in Pakistan. Attention was repeatedly drawn by Pakistani American community to brutal suppression of opposition, gross human rights violation, silencing of media, muzzling of courts, and internet shutdowns. But Biden administration kept on dodging the questions and thus tacitly encouraged the Pakistani military to continue with its reign of terror. Congressman, in November 2023, while reminding Representatives Rektasar and Ilhan wrote to Secretary Blinken to review if United States security assistance is contributing to human rights violations. And on 28 February 2024, after elections were massively rigged in Pakistan by the military, 31 congressmen led by Representatives Rektasar and Susan Wyatt wrote to Secretary Blinken to withhold recognition of an apparently illegitimate government till a transparent and credible investigation is conducted into alleged election interference and irregularities. In June 2024, in an unprecedented move, United States Congress and House Resolution 901 affirmed its support for democracy and demanded investigation into election irregularities and interference by the military. And in October 2024, 4 weeks before the Islamabad massacre, Representatives Brett Kassar, Jim McGovern, yourself, and Congresswoman Summer Lee again led 61 congressmen asking Biden administration to emphasize human rights and rule of law in its policy towards Pakistan, and demanded release of all political prisoners, including the former Prime Minister Imran Khan. Congressmen, all unfortunately fell on deaf ears. Washington ignored the growing crisis, including increasing reports of transnational repression, piling up the Federal Bureau of Investigation. These are hundreds of instances of intimidation and violence against relatives, families, and associates of Pakistani Americans in Pakistan by the military regime for the views expressed within the US for reaching out to the congressmen and for the comments on Twitter, which is, by the way, blocked in Pakistan since 17 February 2024. Congressman, Islamabad massacre was thus the culmination of growing public outrage and helplessness against rigged elections, destruction of the court system, and silence of the international community led by Washington. It was in these circumstances that more than 100,000 protesters marched into capital Islamabad to demand release of political prisoners, restoration of the Supreme Court, and respect for the stolen mandate in February election. Instead of negotiating with peaceful, unarmed protesters, a military operation was conducted in the middle of the night. No one knows how many were really killed, as dead bodies were made to disappear, just like the banana massacre of 1928 in Colombia. I hope Ryan Grimm of Dropsite, who I see here, who did an investigative story, will provide more details about this massacre. Congressman, in my humble opinion, unless the US Congress impresses upon the incoming Trump administration to develop a focus on Pakistan through special envoys and demand person-specific sanctions against the officers of the military regime and police responsible for the massacre, human rights violations, instability and chaos will continue to grow in Pakistan, increasing risk for its neighbors and the United States' interest in the region. Thank you.
Analysis and for that context. Next, we will turn to Mr. Ryan Grimm, who is a journalist and co-founder of Dropsite News, which incidentally is also banned in Pakistan, and you will very soon find out why. He will share a report on how the military leadership planned the attack on unsuspecting protesters and how they covered it up. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you. And I know that in Pakistan, VPNs are very popular, so the ban on Dropsite is only so effective, so it still gets out there. What I'm going to do is read a decent amount of the article into the record here, just so that so it exists here. I don't really think it's my place anyway to tell people in Pakistan, how they ought to run their internal affairs. That's for Pakistanis to determine. What I can do is reveal what information I can with my colleagues in a journalistic capacity, and then I can encourage my government to try to not make things worse. But beyond that, leave that to people who are in Pakistan or who have a connection to Pakistan. So let me read the story that my colleague Murtaza and I are saying. I'll skip over some of the journalistic filler, but we can get to the important parts. The headline was leaked information reveals Pakistan Army planned brutal crackdown on protests, including live fire and subsequent cover-up. The Pakistan Army planned to carry out a lethal crackdown on supporters of the imprisoned former Prime Minister Imran Khan in November, according to a source inside the Pakistan Army, confirmed by a second source with knowledge of the planning. The revelations of the government's multi-stage plan, which included a communications blackout, snipers, tear gas armed soldiers, strategic blockades in the heart of Islamabad, and the use of live ammunition, shows the level of alarm Pakistan's military government feels about supporters of Khan's PTI. Yet at the same time, the chilling details revealed by the source, we are providing ability due to the likelihood of reprisal. Along with the government's repeated denials of the details of its operation, suggests it remains confident in its ability to crush dissent and break the back of the pro-PTI movement. A second source with knowledge of the planning independently confirmed the outlines of the Army source's information.
I can just pause He will go on. There's a lot to cover here.
That covers it.
No, there's a lot to cover, and I'm sure the Congressman has other meetings to attend to. So thank you so much for coming, Congressman Frank Cologne. We really appreciate you being here and to express your views on democracy and human rights in Pakistan. He's our congressman from New Jersey.
Oh, well, thank you. And I don't really have a lot to say, but and you probably heard it from some of the others, but let me just comment a little bit. I think some of you may know or may not that I have I don't want to say large, but I'll call it a large Pakistani American community in my district, which is in the central part of New Jersey, near New Brunswick, where Rutgers University is. We have a number of mosques, and I try to frequent them when I can, particularly on the religious holidays. But I just wanted to say, I value democracy in general, and I know that there have been times in the history of Pakistan when we haven't had a complete democracy, but I still think of it as a very vibrant democracy, and that the people deserve to be able to have fair elections and elect leaders who are going to be responsive to them, which I think is only the case when you have a democracy. If you have an authoritarian regime or a military regime, they're never going to be responsive to the average person, the way the democratic elected leader is. So when I heard from some of my constituents about the election in February of 2024 and what happened was very upsetting to me. Clearly, it's been designated by the State Department as a free and fair election. And of course, there's been the crackdown since then on the supporters of the prime minister who ran in that election. He wasn't allowed to run, really, because it wasn't fair. And, that's just another indication of, the military leaders, if you will, taking a hard line and making it more difficult for people to exercise their right to vote or freedom of speech. We passed a resolution in the House. I think I have the number here. I'm sure I'm familiar with it. And basically expressing our desire that Pakistan go back to a democratic process and the human rights violations not continue. And I just think the United States has an obligation, as does this Congress, to continue to speak out and support those like yourselves that believe in free and fair elections and free speech in Pakistan and throughout the world. I know that what's the term, realpolitik? There are a lot of Americans or even American leaders I'm going to mention who think the U.S. policy should be driven by what I call realpolitik. What's best in our economic interests, what's best in our security interests. But I've always felt that whether it's our economic interests or our security interests, that democracy is always more likely to lead to a government that's more friendly and more helpful to us, both from a national security point of view and an economic point of view. So I don't separate the two. Democratic rights are crucial, and they go along with economic freedoms and national security concerns at the same time. So I'll just continue to be out there speaking out against what's happening and advocating for a free and fair elections and a democratic Pakistan. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for your time. So often, rights get sacrificed on the altar of strategic interests. So thank you so much for saying that. Strengthening human rights regimes actually end up creating more stability, and then that acts in our national security interest as well. So thank you very much for your words. And, we would love for you to say thank you. And Ryan, I'm so sorry if you'd like to resume.
I'll read a little bit.
Yes.
Okay. So I was reading from our article that was published, I don't remember when, about the November massacre, in which do we know yet how many?
Why we confirm that?
Yeah.
What the PJ has confirmed is about 13 or 14, but there are hundreds of people are missing.
Right, and who may be detained, and maybe we'll hear from them a year from now when they're released, or maybe they're dead.
Presumed dead.
You see, there are eyewitnesses that also tell that how the dead bodies were taken away. And the dead bodies that have been recovered are the dead bodies of the people who were shot between 4 p.m. and 9 and 10 p.m. by the snipers. The actual military operation took place after 11 p.m. So you haven't found any dead body from the actual military operation. That's what I call is another massacre in Colombia.
So I'll continue to read briefly from the article. According to the source, who provided substantial evidence to confirm the allegation, and just to be clear for people who are familiar with our reporting, we are often criticized by Pakistan's government for not publishing the documents that are leaked to us. The reason we don't do that should be fairly obvious. That the risk to the people who leak those documents to us is existential. It would be fatal if they were exposed. And so any documents that we publish would include breadcrumbs to get back to the original source. So, according to the source, who provided substantial evidence to confirm the allegation, the operation was planned on the morning of November 25th at the Military Operations Directorate of the Pakistan Army under the direction of General Asim Munir, Pakistan's powerful Chief of Army Staff. Under the plan, Jinnah Avenue, the main road in front of T-Chalk, would be encircled with stacks of shipping containers serving as a barricade. Snipers from Pakistan Army Special Services Group were deployed across rooftops, while paramilitary rangers carrying assault rifles patrolled the roadside alongside police armed with tear gas shells. To execute the plan, the military employed a multi-pronged approach. The first phase was to sow chaos and fear. Lights along Jinnah Avenue were extinguished in the video of that happening, plunging the area into darkness. At the same time, Signals intelligence teams from Pakistan's inter-services intelligence agencies jammed communications networks, which people also reported independently, effectively cutting off the protesters' ability to communicate with each other in the outside world. The blackout was designed to disorient and demoralize the protesters. As confusion gripped the crowd, the second phase of the operation swung into action. The army gave the order to fire tear gas from multiple directions, and the choking fumes sent panicked protesters fleeing. This was the prelude to the main assault. What followed next, a barrage of live ammunition, including heavy assault rifle fire, directed indiscriminately at the fleeing crowds. Snipers positioned strategically on rooftops took aim at those deemed hostile or threatening. The final phase of the operation involved a swift and thorough cleanup. As soon as the firing ceased, ISI units were dispatched to Jinnah Avenue to remove all traces of the violence. This included removing bodies, shell casings, and any other evidence that could contradict the government's narrative of peaceful dispersal. So a lot of this is backed up by eyewitnesses who confirmed that the end of it was visible. This is from the sources inside the government.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Brian, thank you so much for that report. Very comprehensive. We rely on Dr. Credit for investigative journalism. And I would like to now recognize Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who is a hero to many of us and has been at the forefront of speaking out for human rights and democracy and self-determination around the world. And we are so grateful that you are here, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry I couldn't be here on the panel, but as I was walking, I was talking to Tim and I about how Ryan changed his profile picture to the propaganda. Thank you for officially made it. But we all know whether it's the United States or Pakistan, the right to protest is a fundamental right. You all know that. And of course, the right to vote is sacred. And I know all of you understand that importance and understand that it's truly part of who we are as people. To be able to have self-determination, to be able to have that kind of voice. But I agree with the Pakistani people because I've seen, when it personally seen some of the targeting me as an American of different faith, different ethnic background, about suppression of my voice, my First Amendment right, my ability to be able to boycott, all of those things, and how that's interconnected also with a similar kind of attack and suppression that we see of the Pakistani people. And we know how, and how did, the Pakistani regime respond to its own citizens. We all know by shooting them with live ammunition, by tear gassing them, beating them, arresting them, and lying about it. Again, I've also seen that right here in our backyard with protesters and the current president sending out, National Guard and military folks to go out there against the president kind of movement to be able to have a voice and speak up. But we know these anti-democratic measures very much are dangerous. We know that it will lead to, the imprisonment of political opponents, as we saw and so many others. I've heard of journalists, people that even work at NGOs have been targeted simply for trying to protect the Pakistani people and people that are speaking out. But I want to be very clear because I am a person that grew up in the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, where they taught me to speak truth to power, even if even if it's unpopular, even if my voice shakes. I just want you to know I'm very, very much disappointed in my own country for continuing to be an ally to this kind of undemocratic process and just their dangerous, again, attacks on folks being able to speak up. We already dollars in weapons and military aid over the years with little regard to basic human rights. And I always tell people it's not always just Palestine that is impacted by unconditional aid or just not using the leverage that we have as a country. We see it all over the world where my own country continues to fuel that kind of human rights abuses. But we stand here together saying free Imran Khan. We stand here together and saying, we stand together again and say that the Pakistani people deserve to be able to choose their own leaders in a free and fair democratic process. And again, I'll continue to be an ally to speak out. I know it's been very difficult, I think, for many of us, including myself, to see the lack of urgency by our country to move on this issue, to even just voice some sort of opposition to what we've seen over and over again of the violence towards those that are opposed to the current regime and their actions. So again, I'm really honored to be able to be in space with all of you today. And I also want to thank all the Pakistani people who have stood with us against the genocide in Gaza. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for continuing to speak out about that. I also leave you with this, there was no Palestine student organization at Wayne State University when I went there. You can look it up because Ryan Grimm's a researcher. But there, I joined the Pakistani Student Association. Honestly, I'll honestly thought I'd go for Zoom. I would say I'm laughing. I picked up some stuff, but I just want you all to know, for 4 years, I was a member of the Pakistani Student Association. But now, there's a lot of great, wonderful Palestine organization. It was, even then, it was incredibly hard to be an activist on Palestine on campus. It's even, obviously, you see, it's even more difficult. But the courageous students and the captains and the things that we've seen across our country is so incredibly inspiring. But thank you so much for allowing me to be in space with all of you today. So nice. Thank you.
You are an honorary Pakistani, and a profiling courage for all of us, and for everything that you are going through and what Palestinians are going through, and for you to sit here in solidarity with all of us means so much, and we are so incredibly grateful for your allyship. Thank you. And we hope that you will be able to stay for a little bit. Yes, for as long as you can.
I'll look at my stuff. I'm pretty sure.
Thank you so much. And so next, thank you, Ryan, for your remarks. And next, we will now turn to Mr. Wajahat Saeed Khan, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and Emmy-nominated former NBC bureau chief in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Wajahat will speak about U.S. support for Pakistan's military institutions and its implications for Pakistan's democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Honorable Congressman, Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. I've been reporting on conflicts and politics in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India, 3 countries I have lived in, reported from, and still have family and friends in for the last 25 years. Frankly, I'm a fish out of water there in Washington. I really shouldn't be here. I should be back home in Pakistan. And yet, I can't be back home because home no longer feels like home. Strangely, I have easy access to this capital here in Washington and my own capital city of Islamabad, which ironically means the city of Islam, a religion of peace and tolerance. And yet, in that city is where some of my colleagues are buried today. Colleagues like journalist Arshad, like Salim Shahzad, who were killed in the line of duty or doing what they were supposed to be doing in the business of accountability and truth. They were killed for doing their job. Today's briefing is an attribute to heroes like them, heroes who are no longer with us, but have given us the courage to carry on this work of speaking truth to power. The steady attrition of democratic rights and journalistic freedoms over the last 2 decades has seen thousands killed in my country, including dozens of fellow journalists. The pace has picked up, especially over the last few years, and has led to this difficult moment for me and some of my friends on this panel. I really should be bursting with pride being able to speak at this great forum. I mean, the congressman here is from Michigan, where I went to college, and is a local hero for so many years. But I don't have that pride. I should, because that pride should come from the distinction of being embedded with and covering over 100 of the bravest of the Pakistan Army's 250 military units deployed on some of the country's most intense front lines, seeing that country's most courageous soldiers sacrifice their lives. Pride, which comes from hailing from 3 generations of public servants and law enforcement officials. My late father led Pakistan's intelligence bureau. My stepfather served as an instructor in Pakistan's Army aviation. Pride, which comes from launching the country's first independent and Urdu and English news channels and interviewing dozens of its leaders and influencers. And yet, Here I am, a prisoner outside my own country because of the way Pakistan's military and military-backed leaders have treated their best and brightest. What I'm about to tell you and ask you, I do with a heavy heart. Today I'm asking and making a case for movement, for action. I'm making a case for sanctions. Not sanctions that hurt my country. Not sanctions that hurt the 250 million people of Pakistan, over half of which still live under the poverty line, but policies that force change at the very top of the country's Praetorian military and military-backed leadership. As this great country starts with a new Congress and administration, the US must be aware of the flaws and fallacies of its ongoing policies for Pakistan, but also the promise and potential for new ones. The US must be aware because awareness is power. And this Congress should be aware that America's lack of action around repression, such as blatant election rigging, mass arrests, internet shutdowns, abductions and assassinations of journalists and civil rights leaders, and incarceration of democratic leaders like Imran Khan, has been interpreted by the military regime as green light from Washington for further repression. This lack of action endangers not just Pakistanis there, but also many of the 1.2 million Pakistanis right here whose families, loved ones, businesses, freedoms have been targeted by the Pakistani regime through transnational repression. The wave of this repression runs through my home province of Balochistan, where thousands remain missing, abducted by the state, to just next door in Baltimore, which is, like so many other American cities, becoming a shelter of asylum for an increasing number of Pakistanis who are leaving the country in record numbers today, even on ships which sink halfway to Europe. Numbers that have put Pakistan at the top of the world's destinations to leave and at the bottom of the world's index of countries to live in. Whether intended or not, the lack of any consequence for Pakistan on the unprecedented and well-documented human rights violations of the past 2 years have incentivized the regime to brutally track down not just the protest of November 26th, as Movie Pirzada and Ryan Grimm have stated out, but also students, lawyers, activists, even women and children demanding justice and freedom. Freedom to vote, freedom to assemble, freedom to report, freedom to meet their missing relatives, even freedom to tweet. That's right. Just this morning, the government has further affirmed a law that sentences people to 3 years of prison time for a tweet that the regime may deem as fake or coercive. This just happened this morning as we were getting ready for this conference. Zeroing in on Pakistan's military leadership, they rashly believed that they could do more easily, they could weather any blowback for the mass shooting because of the other alternative. Mass protests were likely to gain steam and get international media attention. Attention they were scared of. That's what I'm asking for today, Congressman. Attention. Given its bilateral history with the US, given the dependencies of its military and leadership on Western aid, given that they draw legitimacy from acts of aid and support from this very Congress, given that they train here, retire here, bank here, and invest here, Pakistan would be virtually certain to change its policies of repression if the US even credibly threatened any meaningful action against the senior military or military-backed leaders of that country. The years of silence of the Biden administration, driven by dependency on the Pakistani military by Washington, have been countered by the brave resolutions of this very Congress, H.R. 901, passed last summer, which demanded an investigation into last February's hijacked election. But more is required. Targeted sanctions against architects of the repression, that's top military, intelligence, and government officials who've been named. I'll name them again for the record. General Asim Munir, Interior Minister Mohsen Naqvi and company. Threats to stop coveted U.S. military training and cooperation or conditions on major loans that require Pakistan to adhere to basic democratic norms would immediately lead to change. Trust me, it's happened before. To end, Washington has relied on Pakistani military for its geopolitical goals in the region for decades. But what has that dependency given Washington? Osama bin Laden being housed in a military garrison town, and Afghanistan where the Taliban still rule and repress women and hold Americans hostage, and South Asia where trade with India or curbing the influence of China, or normalization with Iran is still a far shot. And in the middle of all of this, after receiving billions in aid and arms and decades of being given either a green light or being shown a yellow one for tacit approval, lies the unreliable partner. The unreliable partner. That is the Pakistani military. The more reliable partners of America are in this room. The best and brightest, civilian leaders and activists, entrepreneurs and economists, inventors and influencers are being held hostage by that unreliable partner. This action, targeted sanctions, or the credible threat of sanctions, has given the US results in the past, so why not try it again? Finally, this isn't about Imran. It's about what the millions of who will survive Imran Khan, both there and here in the US, will blame Washington in a wave of growing anti-Americanism if the tide is not turned now. There's a joke they tell in GHQ, General Headquarters, the home of the Pakistani military, in Rawalpindi, that the shortest flight to that city takes off from Washington, D.C. This city has power, and it's time for the most powerful in the city, you, the U.S. Congress, to hop on that flight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That's a very compelling your own personal story and also for those compelling arguments about why the US needs to reevaluate its relationship with the Pakistani military. And with that, I'm now going to turn to Mr. Benjamin Linden, who is the Advocacy Director of Europe and Central Asia at Amnesty International. He will share the various statements issued by Amnesty during the massacre, as well as about the broader human rights concerns surrounding political repression and democracy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. Thank you to First Pakistan Global and Representative Kuzar's office for convening us here today. A couple of words very quickly about Amnesty International. We are a nonpartisan organization. We don't favor any political parties. We don't endorse or oppose political figures. We don't certify elections or do anything of that sort. What we do is stand up for human rights globally. We document human rights abuses in line with international law, and we advocate for correcting those abuses. As it relates to Pakistan, I want to talk first about the context broadly within the country on the right to protest. We see generally a pattern of clampdown on protests and freedom of assembly, not just focused on PCI supporters. This is also the case specifically in the case of the Baloch National Gathering, for example, in July, where we saw the use of live ammunition, and even this past weekend, a heavy crackdown by police against Baloch protesters in Karachi during what should have been a peaceful and was a peaceful political mobilization campaign. We've also seen anti-terrorism laws targeting other minority groups, including the Pashtun Taghuz movement and other minority groups, in what is really an affront to the freedom of association and peaceful assembly. The second area of context here that's being utilized in various parts of the country is the use of military force against civilians. The trial by military courts are conducted in complete secrecy with limited access to counsel or opportunity for defendants to prepare for their trials. It allows essentially no right to appeal. Even going back several years to 2019, we saw military trials being used against, just as one example, a human rights defender by the name of Idris Atak, and his trial by military courts, which was completely unfair and arbitrary, as is always inherent in military trials. He had worked for years as a human rights defender. He consulted with Amnesty and other human rights organizations. He remains in detention, and we have called for his release. In 2023, we saw, of course, the arrest of Imran Khan and his trial by military courts. The protesters that protested in the wake of his arrest were tried by military courts. 105 of them, to be exact, with the sentencing of 85 of them. 66 of those remain in detention, and it shows how the use of military courts is an intimidation tactic meant to chill freedom of assembly and it was done selectively. Other protesters were sent to civil courts. So it's done selectively and arbitrarily as far as we can tell from the outside. Turning to the events of November 26th and 27th, we saw initial reports at the time of unlawful use of tear gas and shoot at sight orders being used against protesters. The exact figure of deaths and injuries is unknown due to the clampdown on information. I know the PTI has previously stated 12 protesters were killed. Today I've heard numbers a bit higher, and that's at least those initial 12 had their identities released by the PTI. This much is clear. There needs to be an independent investigation, and the government needs to engage seriously with the PTI's claims. Instead, what we've seen are restrictions on the media, shutdowns of major highways, blockades of cities, and mobile internet shutdowns in response to the PTI protests, which speak for a larger repression throughout the country of the right to protest. Reportedly, 4,000 PTI supporters were detained prior to the protests in November across the country, and 610 were arrested on the day of the protest. Releases of these detained has been scattered. There have been some reports, but it's difficult to put an exact number on those, and still many are certainly in pre-trial detention. As far as we know, they are being tried in civilian courts, but it's tough to verify in all cases. I'm going to wrap up here with some recommendations, and I would say for any Hill staffers here, or those that may work in the administration or may be watching online, I would certainly encourage you to echo and amplify these calls with regard to U.S. approaches to the Pakistani government. First, Amnesty is calling for a prompt, thorough, impartial, effective, and transparent investigation into the deaths and injuries of protesters and the unlawful use of force, including use of lethal and less lethal weapons by security personnel. So far, these calls have gone unheeded. And again, this is not just being targeted at PTI supporters. Second, we're calling for the immediate release of all protesters detained solely for exercising their right to peaceful assembly. And third, we are calling for the end of the use of military courts to try civilians. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Watching and reading Amnesty International's statements during the massacre and afterwards was very helpful in providing some documentation for exactly what happened. So thank you for that. And last but not least, we have Ms. Yumna Rizvi, who is a senior policy analyst with the Center for Victims of Torture, who was in Islamabad at the time of the massacre, and she will now share her observations about Pakistan's changing political climate, as well as actions that Congress can take to address the human rights situation there.
Thank you, Malika, and thank you everyone who's here, as well as staff and members. As Malika said, I was in Islamabad when the massacre happened, and I just want to share some observations of what I saw. The current climate in Pakistan, as my co-panelists have said, is unprecedented repression, with the military actively trying to control a narrative and repress any form of freedom of association and expression. The diminishing trust in the military and support for it is at an all-time low, with increased support for PTI. Despite the repression, some people are showing incredible courage by openly supporting PTI, often at great personal risk. And I'll share two quick examples of what I've observed. The middle-class conservative women, who are largely housewives, whom PTI has been able to mobilize and activate politically, are now engaging in conversations that are critical of the military. This is a generation that has largely not been involved in activism of the 70s or the 80s or the current activism movements. The second is skilled laborers who belong to lower middle class or the working class, who are shop owners and small business owners. They are now naming their businesses after PTI. So we saw Insaf Taylor's out at a commercial center, and he had a poster of Imran Khan in his window. The next time we passed there, the poster was gone, and so we asked him what happened. And he said, the police came and I was told to take it down. And it was against this backdrop of increased repression and resistance that tensions came to a head in November and culminated in the massacre. Days before, we had already seen that shipping containers were starting to line up around the highways. The government was
showing what it was preparing for, creating a sense of anxiety and urgency as people were rushing to complete their work and finish their errands, because it's unclear how long the lockdown would last. By Sunday night, and I have some pictures in my phone and videos if folks want to see, by Sunday night, entry and exits to and from Islamabad were blocked, and certain roads within Islamabad were closed off as well. Mass transit was suspended, riot police were out at multiple points with barbed wire, prisoners' vans were out on the streets, and commercial and business areas were closed. Mobile networks were down by Sunday night. And most people in Pakistan at this point are used to some of these measures, right? When protests happen, when religious processions happen, but there were some things in part of this that were unprecedented, such as raids in homes and apartment buildings to find PTI sympathizers. And certain areas of Islamabad, which are 20 to 25 minutes away from Dijak, where I was, our commercial centers were also closed. We had just one pharmacy open and one other grocery store that had one light on, and half the shutter was down. We were getting reports of women and children being beaten at the airport, and by Tuesday night, when the police was firing indiscriminately at Dijak, we were, again, 20, 25 minutes from there, but we heard gunshots throughout the night in our neighborhood as well. The next morning, a friend of mine texted me saying they killed a lot of people, which even now to me is like blood-curdling. Throughout the night, when most enough was coming on television talking about the shoot at sight orders and talks of imposing a curfew, there was definitely a sense of fear and anxiety of what was going to happen. It was unclear what we would wake up to the next day. What I've heard from folks and what I witnessed was that it was an unprecedented number of people who showed up, as well as an unprecedented outcome. People did not expect this to happen. Upsam, who's a famous journalist, former country director of OSF, was live near Dijak at an office building's rooftop and also was saying he had never seen something like this before. The number of deaths, as my panelists have said, is disputed. Wadiullah John, again, a journalist who was reported from outside one of the hospitals, trying to get data and information on number of deaths or injured, was ultimately detained by the law enforcement agencies. And so this is the current climate of Pakistan. Like, this is what we're dealing with. And so for members here and for staff here, just a few recommendations on what Congress can do. So domestically, push for more robust and regular laity vetting, to suspend security assistance to units and individuals who are implicated in human rights violations, gross violations of human rights, such as torture, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings, all of which we've seen. Pass the 502B resolution. Efforts around Pakistan in the last year or so congressionally have been bipartisan. It shouldn't be that hard to do. A 502B resolution would essentially suspend all security assistance to Pakistan, not just specific units or individuals. And at the international level, I would urge members to engage with the EU and your counterparts in the European Parliament. Pakistan is a recipient of the EU's GSP Plus preferential trade agreement. The GSP Plus status is conditional upon Pakistan's compliance with 27 international conventions on human rights, labor, environmental protection, and good governance, including the 9 UN core human rights treaties, of which Pakistan is a signatory of 7. The GSP Plus review takes place every 2 years. And in the past, revocation has been threatened because of Pakistan's human rights concerns, but Pakistan's continued to retain it. And so I would urge members to engage with the EU delegation here, as well as members of the International Trade Committee at the European Parliament and the South Asia Committee.
Thank you so much, Yumna. Thank you for sharing your personal experience of how it was in Islamabad that very, very fateful day. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their very incisive analysis and their expertise. Thank you all so much for giving of your time. Congresswoman, thank you so much for staying for the course of this panel. We really appreciate your help, and we really hope that you will remain at the forefront of sort of galvanizing your colleagues in Congress to in support of human rights and democracy in Pakistan. We're coming to the end of this forum, everyone. But again, as we had mentioned, the Pakistani diaspora is literally just getting started. You have seen how much we have accomplished over the past year, and today you heard in gruesome detail about the cruelty that was unleashed on unarmed and peaceful protesters and the callousness with which it was covered up. and you have seen the context within which this massacre was allowed to happen, and you have also heard how important it is for the US government to now re-evaluate its relationship with the Pakistani military. For far too long, our rights, the rights of the Pakistani American people and the rights of the Pakistani people have been trampled in pursuit of strategic interest. We cannot let that happen anymore. The perpetrators, the masterminds, the architects of repression in Pakistan are people like General Asim Munir, are people like Mohsen Naqvi. We have to name them, we have to shame them, and we have to build on the letters that we have come up with, or our congressional representatives have come up with over the past year. And now at this very moment, the Pakistani diaspora is working with congressional representatives to draft legislation that would mandate sanctions, targeted sanctions against individuals like General Asim Munir, like Mohsen Naqvi, who happens to be visiting at this point. We don't want these people getting visas to come to the US. We don't want these people being able to store their stolen wealth here in foreign bank accounts. And that is what we're working for, binding legislation that will prevent that from happening. For far too long, they have operated with impunity, and we will not let that happen. For all the congressional staffers here, I'd ask you to please join the growing list of congressional representatives who've been supporting human rights and democracy in Pakistan and who've been calling for accountability. For all the Pakistani Americans who are here, gathered here today, and who listen to all this incredible testimony, please join our efforts. We are, again, just getting started, but we need to be consistently engaged. Just after 2 years of congressional engagement, you've just seen what currently happen. We have champions like Greg Kazar and their incredible aides, and everybody else who's here, championing our cause. And so we need your support, and we need the support of our representatives. Thank you all so much. If you have questions, our wonderful speakers will be here for a little bit longer. You can mill around with them and ask them questions directly. Again, thank you all so much for being here.
I'm kind of sad she didn't do my intro on my work in Pakistan, but that's okay. I wasn't just there just to be there, but...